Hi, I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And this is Will and Luke Discuss,
a vodcast
and podcast
where we discuss content related to psychology,
personal growth,
self-development,
and well-being. This episode, we're discussing
Carpe Diem Regained, The Vanishing Art of Seizing the Day by Roman Krznaric. And I should also say the American version is called Carpe Diem, Seizing the Day in a Distracted World. Slightly less sophisticated title. For some reason, the American publishers went for a different title, but there you go. Same book.
Nice. So this book was recommended to you by one of your friends who said it was, he really enjoyed it and thought it'd be worth reading. And then I took that recommendation from you as well. And we've given this a crack. So I'm really excited to do this book. It was a really well written book, split up really nice into different sections, and is kind of a topic that I think often we don't think about in kind of in great detail, considering the term Carpe Diem is quite an all-encompassing existential philosophy for living, and there's lots of different catch-all sayings that people have kind of based around Carpe Diem, living life to the fullest, not living with regret, making the most of what we do have. Things we'll definitely get into today, but it's interesting, from what he says, that this isn't actually a very well researched topic, and people don't tend to think about it in any sophisticated way. So I'm really happy with the level of detail he's gone into, and also the ideas that it's sprung up. And I think it's something that I'll really enjoy talking to you about for sure.
Yeah. So just a bit of background then. It came out in 2017. Roman Krznaric, I hope I'm saying that right. He's what he calls himself a public philosopher, whatever that means. And he's a co-founder of the School of Life. He's written a few other books on empathy, and I think he's just brought a new one out. So
deep work.
Yeah, he's kind of it's interesting as well with this. He said he had like a team of researchers. So as you point out, they properly dug into like the whole history of this phrase Carpe Diem and looked at all the different ways throughout history people have construed it and what it's meant to different people over time. And he talked about, like, he will ask public audiences, who thinks it means this and who thinks it means this. And it's quite a varied catch-all saying. So that's what the book kind of digs into, and then gives you, I guess, a bit of life advice on how to take away the gold from it, and then how to notice where Carpe Diem has been hijacked, as he calls it, by areas which aren't perhaps as fulfilling.
And he talks about that there's different like interpretations of Carpe Diem, and there's 5 key ones that I imagine we'll go through today, and how kind of finding a balance between all of them is the way. And I guess just to start off, he's referring to Carpe Diem as a philosophical idea that embodies a vision of how to live, similar to concepts, love and truth. He says it's about avoiding death and expressing a desire for freedom. It's a call to have no regrets and to look at life as paths not to have no regrets and not look at life as paths not taken, making the most of the time we have. So there's some ideas in there about the thinking self versus the remembering self, and the experiencing self, all in there as well. And he points out how over hundreds and thousands of years, this is a saying that has kind of been embodied by multiple cultures. So there's a saying in Japan which is enjoy now. In Slovak, there's live fully. There's a Jewish saying that is if not now, when. And it's just interesting how we're talking just before the podcast started that people are very quick to give kind of advice in moments where you're either trying to make a decision to do something meaningful with your life, or do something spontaneous, or do something a bit wild, a bit out there. People say, live your best life, or live like there's no tomorrow, and YOLO, and all these other ones that just kind of come through. I guess it's just an interesting thought that it is something that across different cultures is acknowledged, that there's an importance to be able to make the most of the day that you have. Yeah, but there's ways that saying has been tainted. So he says kind of we've all become very, very busy. It's a lot harder to be spontaneous. Kind of just do it has turned into just plan it. We have a lot of guilt around wasting time. We don't want to miss out on things. I'm listing quite a few here, but he's basically saying like modern day cultural impacts have got in the way of us being able to seize the day because we're continually distracted, whether that's by technology, whether that's by continuing ambition to be better and more and quicker and faster and consuming and all those different things. And, the impacts of television, internet, modern day technology that's just pinging off in your pocket, demanding your attention. And in particular about that lack of ability to kind of be in one place at one time. There's multiple nows that we're contending with and multiple versions of ourselves that we're having to kind of acknowledge on a moment to moment basis.
Yeah, because you can think of like, well, the Nike slogan, like just do it. Like you can think of what he talks about, that energy of like, essentially the energy is just just do it. It can be poured into like buying things, so just like clicking online and buying stuff on Amazon. It can be poured into like watching that next show on Netflix, like screw it, I just watch the next one, so that sees
eating that cake.
Exactly. It can be poured into ways which we will look back and perhaps regret. One thing he talked about is the average, I don't know where he got these stats from, but like the average person in some study watches 3 hours of TV a day. And if you live to a certain age, I think the average age of 79 or whatever, that would be like 9 years of your life you'd spent watching television. And so there are examples of the kind of like, screw it, just do it attitude, which can actually not be very fulfilling. Just watch it can be one, just buy it. He came
just plan it,
just
about how our lives become, like, in order to live a good life we have to feel productive, and life becomes a series of like tick lists, and rather than kind of immersing ourselves in experiences, we kind of do things for the sake of ticking them off in order to feel like we're doing more and that we're making the most of life.
So and that's massive nowadays. Well, he says that one really took off since the Industrial Revolution, and you had like the factory clock, and people were starting to live by their watches and by calendars, and but really like focusing on time. And I mean, reading that part of the book is like, I just related to that so much. We've all got, well, I have recently got my digital calendar. I've got all my appointments in, like so much of my life is now scheduled and like planned. And that can sort of drain away any, I guess, actual time and also just mental energy to practice the spontaneity that you talked about.
I was keeping in mind, some of the previous podcasts we've done about, Thiago Forte's second brain, kind of keeping our lives organized, how we plan out our lives, lifestyle design we've talked about in the Tim Ferriss one. Like that was niggling away at me as I was reading through this. I'm kind of like, it's possible to go too far one way. We're wanting to be productive and make the most of our time and not waste any of it, but also at risk of not immersing ourselves into maybe more high quality, meaningful activities. And he also made a comparison to moving to Brazil for a number of months. I think he lived there for, say, 6 to 12 months or something. And he was saying just how time operated on a different level. And I know me and you always reflect on, if we lived in Spain, that we wouldn't be feeling this sense of urgency to rush around and be productive and that sort of thing. I think it's, I guess, interesting before we kind of get into this, just to acknowledge that there's maybe some cultural impacts on this as well, in the terms of how people make the most of the day and what they deem to be productive and a meaningful life, and why certain places and people, even regarding like your age and your life stage as well, what kind of pressures are you feeling to make the most of your day, and what does that mean to you within the cultural context you live in?
I definitely felt that when I studied in Greece. When I was studying in Greece, it was like we'd have like a lunch break, and then I was very aware that the class was about to start in like a couple of minutes, and that no one was obviously in any rush to grab their bags and leave. It was then like 5 past, 10 past. I was like, guys, we really need to. And like we'd stroll back, and the teacher would be sort of late and not caring either, and it would just be it was like, this would be so different in England. So there's definitely a cultural aspect to this, like just plan it attitude as well. That kind of how you relate to time. I think he quoted some study where people had measured how accurate the clocks were in different countries, and I think Switzerland was like number one, and I don't know, I think he was talking about Brazil, that was really low down the list, as you know, the clocks were all over the shop. It's quite funny. Funny social study.
Interesting. Awesome. Well, I think that's a good introduction, just kind of give an idea of, you know, what we're talking about, and what some of the how the term Carpe Diem has been hijacked. So you're hoping to move into the 5 interpretations he's got of Carpe Diem. Which one were you hoping to start with?
Well, so I'll list them. So the 5 ways he's researched across history this has been used, the way we use it is spontaneity, presence, politics, hedonism, and opportunity.
Yeah.
I'll start with the last one. Let's start with opportunity then.
Opportunity. Yeah. Cool.
One thing I remember, he talked about that word, the origin of that word. It has port in it, right? And the word comes from like sailing towards a port, and then there being a favorable wind, and so like you can just lift your sails and it will take you right into the harbor. And so an opportunity is like, do you lift your sails when there's some wind behind you? Like, do you, if something shows itself, do you grab it basically? Or do you feel like, no, if I lift my sails, that wind's going to blow me into the rocks. So it's better safe than sorry. I won't bother doing that. So that's kind of a cool etymological understanding of the word. But yeah, it's kind of times where things just arise in your life, and can you grab it or not? So I don't know, like it's on a very small level. It can be like, do you notice notice boards in your local town where they have events on, and do you just ever pick up a flyer and go to something? You know, it can just be small things like that. Go on.
And inherent in that is kind of like that there's a choice in which to, like, are you choosing to take that gust of wind behind you and go with it, or are you choosing not to? It's not kind of necessarily a matter of like choosing, or things just carry on the same. Like, not choosing is a choice. Like, so in terms of like opportunities, in this kind of, that there is something has presented itself to you, and it almost presents itself as like a fork in the road. It's like, which way do you want to go here?
The story
you can't afford to like evade that responsibility, you know?
Right. Like just not choosing to do things is also a choice. Definitely. I think that's something we probably has come up a lot in other books. I really like the story he opened the chapter with. He talked about this old guy in a nursing home who had been like denied the privilege of going over to France. He was like a war veteran, and there was a what would you call it, like an event perhaps on D-Day or something, like, or VE Day,
Remembrance Day.
And he really wanted to go to it, and they didn't let him out for whatever reason, and he like snuck out in the night and managed to like get onto a ferry, and like was taken under the wing of some other veterans, and the nursing home, you know, they in the morning found out he wasn't there and called the police and tried to track him down, and he'd just been out having the day of his life. And I think 6 months later or something, he died. So that was his last opportunity to do that, and he just grabbed it and took it and went and did it. And like it sort of, in the news article, it sort of captured the imagination of, like, you know, that's a classic example of grabbing an opportunity that's there.
He talks about there's different ways of seizing opportunities. So there's kind of like the self-seeking opportunist. So that's someone exactly like the guy just described, sees a chance to do something and takes it. They've made a choice. They've not been passive. They're keeping regret at bay, and it's really on like the cutting edge of, you know, that's a choice you're making. Like you're choosing to do something and make the most of that opportunity. And then there's the experimentalist. So that's kind of a bit more of a varied approach, where you're kind of like taking what life presents you, and you're kind of winging it as you go along, like expecting to be able to like learn most things as you go along. So that would kind of be if, you know, you were offered maybe a job that you weren't quite sure you knew how to do, but you were just like, I'll just give it a go and I'll work it out. You know, he gave a few examples of people who've worked in some like crazy industries without the qualifications. So they're kind of a bit more in the sense like trusting that you're going to land on your feet and just kind of going with the flow, but in more of a different way, like sort of expecting yourself to kind of pick it up as you go along. That's
just chucking yourself in the deep end and just trusting you'll be all right and you'll be able to do it. Yeah.
And then there's the next two. He said, there's the death gazer, which is one of them. He says, so that's someone who there's new opportunities every day, and it's kind of that's inspired by the concept of of death, that we are going to die one day, and sort of just like that real fearlessness to be like, well, I'm going to die, so I might as well do this thing. And it's quite close to the daredevil one, which is around like thrill seeking and kind of seeking things that like dance with death a bit, like kind of on the edge, like to feel a bit closer to it in order to feel more alive and to feel like you've made the most of life, like a head-on collision with life. Yeah, he
talked about the guy who walked a tightrope between the Twin Towers with no no safety net or ropes or anything. It's like,
I felt sick reading that.
It's obviously an extreme version, but I think we can all relate to wherever our personal like threshold is, that like thrill you can get from doing something a little bit scary, and whether it's a bike jump or a bungee jump or walking over a tightrope on the Twin Towers, it's that adrenaline junkie seeking mentality.
It might be good time just kind of cross over on a tangent here. He talks about that whole dancing with death, and in modern day culture where we don't have many what he calls as like death reminders to inspire us to kind of live our lives to the fullest. He's saying like with maintaining the idea that you're not going to live forever ever, and that tragedy could strike at any moment. I mean, there is that old saying, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, so there's concepts of that, but I think he's saying like not to take it too literally, but it's more about like kind of maintaining a perspective and like existentially checking in with yourself regularly, that the fact that you're not going to live forever, and it's important to kind of do what matters and do things that you value, that are kind of in line with your like a personal mission, a personal way of living that you want to live by. And without that, you don't get the full perspective on the life you're currently living. Like if you realize that you've got X amount of years left to live, you want to spend those years in a meaningful way. Like it's not unnecessarily nihilistic to look at things that way, but it's interesting.
No, definitely. That's like, that's probably the core feature of Carpe Diem, right? In his, he drew this mandala, this graphic of every concept he covers in the book. And in the middle of it is the yin and yang of death and freedom. And this concept, not even concept, this reality that we're all going to die is fundamental to seizing the day. And to the degree that we have all these personal and social and cultural ways of denying our death anxiety. But if you can trick yourself into thinking it's never going to happen, then why seize the day, right? You've got forever. You don't, but you can trick yourself into feeling as if you do. And he talked about the medieval times where, people were dropping like flies. There was so much more spontaneity and gusto and seizing the day. There'd be dances in churches, there'd be carnivals in the street popping up quite a lot, and people drinking and being merry, and all these other ways of seizing the day: hedonism, spontaneity, opportunity. And that, again, with he talked about through sort of Protestantism and the factory clock, we sort of hammered that out of society so much, where we're less likely to act on that spontaneity, I guess. But underpinning that is this idea that you are going to die, and it's a very stoic and existential way of looking at things. Look back on he gave us all these tricks. A lot of them are stoic ones, but like if you imagine yourself in your deathbed looking back, how would you want your life to look? If you had 6 months left to live, what would you do with that time? And seriously ask yourself that question.
I really like some of these suggestions he puts in there. So there's obviously like the stoic ones around like extracting the full value from the day. The deathbed test of like, if transport yourself to your deathbed, like would you feel proud? Would you have regret? And and he talks about some of the common regrets are like working too hard, not living true to yourself, not being honest, not being open to new experiences. And a lot of those revolve around like intimate relationships. But I really, really like a couple of the ones in here. So you mentioned the one around, thinking 6 months, 12 months times. And he goes, thinking about your life, when people say live each day as if it's your last. Yeah. He's basically saying that actually that's probably not entirely helpful. Like you can probably expand, say maybe live as if you had 6 months left to live, or this was your final decade on Earth.
So play with that. Play with use the thought experiment and play with it. Because, like you say, if this is actually your last day alive, well, I don't know. Yeah. You treat it very differently than if it was the last day of your last 6 months, right? Because you can do something, you can do a project in a 6 month period that you can't do in a day. So, and then again, like you say, a decade is different again. So it's just using these hypothetical mental exercises to like gauge kind of what you want with your time. And he personally said he found 6 months the most helpful kind of time frame, because it's like it's short enough that it's like kicks your ass in gear, but long enough that you can actually, take up singing lessons or like do a project you've always wanted to do. Yeah.
There's some other really great ones in there. One like Nietzsche says around like eternal recurrence. So it's like you're not willing,
I like that one.
If you're not willing to like live the current life you've got over and over. So if you had to live your life all over again, would you still live it in the same way? If not, like, make some changes as well. And there's also
not just all over again, but indefinitely. Like if for infinity, for eternity, you had to live this same life over and over and over and over and over. It's like, make sure you get it right the first time, because you're going to have to repeat it forever. It's like that. I really thought that was quite funny. I quite enjoyed that one.
My favorite one, actually, I was so happy because it kind of quotes about the concept of one of my favorite movies called About Time. Oh yeah, it's like I don't know if you've seen it.
I've not, no.
But it's a British. You kind of call it. It's not a rom-com, but it's like a really sweet British movie, and it's about basically this guy who has this ability to travel back in time and relive the day he had before. And and he's it's all tied in with like his father's kind of dying, so he's trying to relive moments to make the most of those times with his father. But the main concept around it is if live today as if you lived like yesterday, so you don't repeat imaginary mistakes. So imagine you're trying to correct the mistakes you made of today as if you're living it again. So I guess what happens in the movie is that the guy goes through the day and he sees moments that maybe previously caused him anger or stress, or he had arguments or things weren't going well. He was able to kind of view them in a different way. So like when he was walking to work and got rained on, he kind of learned to laugh and enjoy it and just like get soaked in the rain. Or instead of choosing to like argue with his partner, he chose to be a bit more understanding. And I guess that's a really nice thought experiment to go like, you can kind of correct that mistake as if it's already happened. I really like that idea.
I'll jump in on that because there's a couple of ideas and it's a little abstract. So in the actual movie, you're saying that he actually does go back and is able to correct things that he knows he's already done. But the thought experiment, we obviously can't do that. So the thought experiment is sort of pretend as if today has already happened, and and like kind of almost imagine the type of regrets you are likely to have knowing who you are, and like imagine you're repeating this day, and like imagine you've already done this. It's like, don't do that again, even though you haven't. So that's a bit more of a tricky one to get your head around, but it's sort of pretending as if you've already had this day and don't make the same mistake twice. Yeah,
it's a really nice. I think that's probably my favorite, mate. Probably because I really like the movie. But no, it's a really good one. I'd highly recommend it. So I think we're just taking a bit of a tangent from the art of seizing the opportunity to kind of touch on death reminders and what different ways of conceptualizing that. I think I'd really like to just touch on one of my favorite types of people who seize opportunities, and one of them was the role breaker. I don't know if that stood out to you or not, but it's kind of talking a lot about how we have different roles in our lives, and each of them have kind of got their own, personality, expectations, specific ways of like acting and being. So whether that's like your kind of your work life, your relationships, different ways you express yourself emotionally. And he's basically saying that we can learn to but by letting go and trying to rechange our narratives. I know something we've spoken a lot about in maybe Search for the Secure Base and other podcasts we've done. But we can let go of certain roles, rid ourselves of distractions, let go of the small things, hold things a little bit lighter. And he's saying, decide who we want to be instead of kind of being comfortable with the already existing roles that we have. We can be open to changing and kind of updating our maps in a way. We can change who we are. We can change the roles we have in life by letting go of like social and emotional expectations we have on ourselves. Yeah.
So there are there are obviously different roles we find ourselves in, and they, to some degree, they require different headspaces, different skills. Like even to some degree, knowing that we've pressed record, you and I are probably in a slightly different role than if we were just chatting and this wasn't recording, right? And if we were, I don't know, at work or with partners or like in the pub or whatever, your context and who you're with and what you're doing changes your roles. But underneath all that, it's kind of like you can really have quite distinct personas in these roles where it becomes almost like you're just almost denying yourself. I think he says they can take over. He says they can take over, and he asks you to go like, how authentic are we being in the roles we play? That's the word, authenticity. Yeah. He talked about, he gave an anecdote of a waiter, right, who was just so in the role of waiter. There was just no, whilst he was in this role, there was no human being there. It was just this mask, just this persona of have a nice day, sir, and this customer service front. And it's really nice at times where you interact with someone in a customer service role and they just seem like a real person. Like those moments are really quite nice. And I guess that's what he's saying, isn't it? I'm glad you used that word authenticity, because he's like, you can bring that sense of authenticity, whatever role you're in. And, lots of the boundaries we keep in the roles we find ourselves in are just social conventions that aren't actually good for our individuality. Obviously. And if we have like one too many of those roles, and we're kind of sticking in these different roles, we're actually kind of not living, as you say, like authentically or like with any sort of integrity. We're just existing in these different roles, just jumping from one place to another without actually kind of being free and not feeling fulfilled if you're constantly darting between those. Yeah, just like bending yourself to what you think the social expectations are of you in this moment. And it's like too much of that, and you start just disowning most of yourself, most of your free self, most of your authentic self. And he said that like limits your like personal choice and your vision for yourself. Like you can really restrict yourself with that. And I think it goes quite nice into the whole concept. I think what we're talking here, we're bringing up a lot of different like concepts and ways of being and ways of thinking about living. And I guess what he's trying to say is like, it's a balance between each of these things. That we're able to kind of take a bit of that, remind ourselves of this sometimes, maybe try and be a bit more like this in these situations. And I guess as we kind of proceed, I think that's something I'm trying to hold on to, is that not trying to go too hard on one of these ideas, but also think which ones could I maybe be a bit more open to, or on the opposite side, am I holding too tightly? Am I being too fixed on one role in my life rather than being a bit more like spontaneous and free in them, holding them too tightly? And especially, think about like narratives and schema and worldviews that we've spoken about in previous podcasts as well. Like this really taps into that too. Yeah, it's not that prescriptive, is it? He's not really saying like live all these ways, because he's also saying, well, if you're too spontaneous and you don't plan anything, that could be a mess as well. So it's more of a reflection of finding your own, like just bringing these ideas into your consciousness and deciding how far do you want to take them. With that in mind, I meant to bring this up at the start. So our last book we covered was Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order, right? And we sort of joked, well, I think we both sort of joked at the start that although he was trying to go beyond order and like into chaos and how we can bring ourselves into chaos in a way that's fulfilling to ourselves, we sort of joked that he perhaps struggled to really go there, perhaps because of his own personality, and it was still quite an orderly approach to life. Yes. And I actually find in tying this book in, it really this is really testing you to go beyond order and to be like, if you're going to put chaos and creativity into your life, like where's the limits of that? And I actually found this book was a really good add-on to the last book, because it really pushes the boundaries of going into chaos and obviously going too far, perhaps. But and
it's kind of it's acknowledging that. Yeah, it's acknowledging the dangers of things that, like hedonism and being overly spontaneous, as you just said, but also kind of going like, there are some circumstances in which it might be good for you. So I think a perfect lead on here is, to what he describes as like the hidden virtues of hedonism, which is one of the five ways of seizing the day. Talks about, he's saying, the common conception of that is that you're just kind of having pleasure for pleasure's sake without any regard for the consequence and that sort of thing. But he's saying that, and he does recommend, like specifically saying for like short-term intense bursts of hedonism, as kind of like an experiential and approach to life, a way of it can be like quite life affirming, quite exciting, a way of personal expression, freedom, passionate living, all those sorts of things. Like there's ways of exerting yourself in like hedonistic ways without it being kind of like really damaging, or, it's not sort of kind of just like on this, like a party for like a whole month, just getting absolutely hammered, taking every drug under the sun, like do all that sort of, like, he's kind of saying, there's different ways of kind of letting loose without it affecting the rest of your life.
You can certainly take hedonism as a lifestyle, and as you say, like it can over time really damage you, but he's perhaps saying that we've had so much of that message that, well, to some degree, all we have is our conscious experience, and our senses, our sensory experience is what's happening most, if not all, of our life, right? So if the world has pleasurable sensory experience to offer us, like you want to taste some of that sometimes. You want the cheesecake or the sex, or to try this drug once or twice, or to smell the roses, to learn to get back into your senses and enjoy your sensory carnal experience is a huge part of what life's about. And obviously it can be taken too far, like all these things, but it can also be underdone, and you can live too much in your head and not enjoy things while they're there, not stroke the cat on the street when you see one, that sort of thing. And he's kind of advocating for, kind of like short bursts of immersive experiences where you can like kind of really feel everything you just described, like really feel it in its entirety. So and enjoying that is very different to sort of like buying takeaway after takeaway because you're in a rut and you're a bit depressed and you can't be bothered to go, like do you know what I mean? There's being on top of the world and grabbing a sensory experience and loving it, versus like falling into addiction or something like that. And it's worth like reflecting on what you want from life in terms of pleasure.
And in terms of like how considered are you in that as well? Like he's almost kind of saying that, like, well, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it in like a considered way, rather than kind of a total loss of control that you can't bounce back from. Like no irreversible damage. Like give yourself the grace. I guess it kind of does go a bit against the whole kind of like the chaos side of things, like almost providing kind of like some sort of structure within which to let go and to be chaotic. Essentially, it's kind of like giving yourself that short period of time in a way that isn't going to kind of damage you for the rest of your life potentially. Like balancing the associated risks, I suppose, with the enjoyment that's available. He also threw in a little bit here about I guess wealth inequality, because to some degree hedonism could be framed as like, well, only rich people can do that, who can afford the yachts and the trips around the world and all this. But he was saying, however poor you are, you can enjoy sex with your partner, you can enjoy a good meal, depending on how poor you actually are. But to some degree, most people can find small pleasures in life. You can smell the flowers, you can enjoy petting animals, or like the sensations of holding your children, or whatever it is, that it's not just a class thing, but everyone can find their pleasures in life. Within relationships and within creativity as well. I think he touches on too, it's accessible there too. I did enjoy, for some reason, I don't know why I enjoyed it so much, but chapter 6, like beyond the now of mindfulness.
Okay.
and kind of how.
So this would be moving on. We've looked at opportunity and hedonism. This would be looking at presence.
The presence, yeah. So one of the interpretations of Carpe Diem, and I guess it got me thinking a lot because I suppose I do quite a lot of meditation and listen to a lot of content related to mindfulness and ways of being, and also I didn't mind the slight dig at Eckhart Tolle as well, which I enjoyed. But it was.
Well, you and I have we've done a few books like the Happiness Trap, Waking Up. For lots of that, it's mindfulness and cooperative.
So about those like key themes of like present moment awareness, paying attention to your experience, non-judgmental, like that. A non-judgmental attitude. I think it's just interesting to think that some of the conceptualizations of like seizing the day is a lot about like just be in the moment, be present, be exactly where you are. That's all you need to be. Eckhart Tolle says, the past and the future are just causes of suffering. Like the present moment is all that the present moment is like all that you need to kind of feel okay and feel happy. But I guess he points out some really interesting ideas about how actually, kind of happiness and meaning are found in kind of the responsibilities we take and the desires we have for like an improved future. So like having goals and also having a past kind of informs us of where we are and where we're going. And that all kind of ties into like a sense of meaning. And he does it. There's this really nice quote. He says it's when riding a bike, it's refreshing to focus on feeling the breeze on your face. It's useful to know if there's a double-decker bus behind you and traffic lights ahead. Mindfulness might encourage us to notice our reflection, but we will need guideposts based on our past experiences and future goals or desires to help us make choices and live a meaningful life.
That's funny.
I think that was such a good way of conceptualizing. And I guess I think I guess I'm kind of on a bit of a run here, but I think the bit I really took away from this chapter was that mindfulness is a fantastic way of being like, okay, I'm in this moment, lean into it and feel it entirely, like drop into the moment when that feels like that's what you need. But it's also kind of being able to notice when we're kind of getting dragged away from that too, and we can bring ourselves back to whether it's an enjoyable experience or the project or meaningful activity we're doing. But it's around having a choice whether we follow our thoughts like back to the past or into the future, and that's okay. We don't need to exist entirely in the present. Like sometimes it's helpful to be taken back to the past so we can reflect and learn from our behavior and understand ourselves more, and just going with that, and that's okay. And then with the future, like it's okay to plan and have goals and set yourself a direction and have an aim and work towards something meaningful. And we can go with that. There's, I guess, it just seems if you take it too literally, be in the moment. You're neglecting like whole aspects of psychological continuity that could provide quite a lot of value in your life.
It's really important. He talks.
That's my summary. So
whereas the other four ways of seizing the day have quite more of a historic root. He's like this one of presence, this idea of being in the moment as seizing the day is only sort of 20 years old, really, in terms of a cultural phenomenon.
The mindfulness movement, early 2000s,
and like you say, obviously, if we're like with the acceptance and commitment therapy stuff we discussed with the happiness trap, obviously, if you're only living in the past and just making like living in regret or thinking about the terrible things that are going to happen in the future, and that's only where your mind is, and obviously you're going to suffer too much. But even that idea he points out can be taken too far, in that it doesn't mean we want to be in the present all the time. Like our natural human capacity to reflect back and have a life narrative, like we covered in Search for the Secure Base, and to actually have meaningful projects that we're working towards that are underpinned by our values, and being able to think about the future in that regard is a massive part of being human, and the meaning and responsibility we can take from life, and the joy that can come of it. So he had quite a few critiques, I guess, of the mindfulness approach and ways in which it can be taken too far. And certainly there's a balance to be found in living in the past, the present, and the future.
Well, he was saying there's other ways we can think about it as well. He did actually touch on flow, which we've obviously done a podcast on. So, around being like immersed in the zone of, having optimal experiences by being in like the zone of proximal development, choosing challenges that are hard enough to keep us interested, but not too hard that we become anxious. And then talks a bit about, wonder and awe and looking at beauty and that sort of thing.
Sorry,
there's other ways of,
but he's saying that the way this mindfulness has been put forward is, how it's sold in like mindfulness-based stress reduction is, you're very quiet, you're sat down, your eyes are closed, you're breathing slowly, you're very peaceful, you're very calm. And he's saying that we don't want to allow that to hijack our idea of what it means to be in the moment. So sorry to interrupt you, but that's
no, it's really good.
Underpins these ideas he's showing. Actually, in flow, when you're on a surfboard and you're both exhilarated and a little bit terrified, and you're using your skill at full capacity, and like that is nothing like sat on a cushion breathing slowly, but you're there, you're right in the moment. And he's saying there are the other ways of being present, than being like calm and serene, that are really important to living.
Yeah. And you're describing exuberance there, like what you describe, like that kind of like you're brimming with like excitement and energy, and it's all going off. And then like, wonder and awe and collective ecstasy, which I really like that one. So, when you're like at a football match or a concert, or it did make me think about that time we went traveling in Spain, and we kind of just joined in like a street carnival and like left our bags with the old ladies because they said they'd look after them. And we just kind of like went and got stuck. There was that sense of like we were so present in that moment. Yeah, that wasn't kind of there was so much going on. Yeah, but it doesn't need to be like, as you say, calm and peaceful. It can be just like kicking off. Present.
Like like you said, chanting in a football stadium. Like, how in the moment can you be in that? Or at a rave, like he's saying, there are ways. Another critique, I guess, is don't allow the mindfulness movement to suggest that the only way of being present is to be like serene and slow and quiet and peaceful. And actually, like you can be like really exhilarated and excited, and that can be really present focused as well.
I like the way it's kind of you can just use it as a tool, as almost as a way of like being spontaneous slightly. Like you can kind of go like, okay, this is the moment I'm in, here's what I'm experiencing, but I also have these other choices available to me to kind of seize the opportunity or be spontaneous or take a step back or take a step forward. Like it's sort of it opens up choice, doesn't it? By having strong mindfulness skills. Like that's obviously the benefit. It's not kind of a passive thing. It's a thing you can respond to and act upon and live by. And
choice is what all this is about, isn't it? Like at the core, it's like, remember you're going to die, and remember you have choice. Those are the two sort of existential poles which all this philosophy is based by. And to the degree, as you say, that mindfulness helps remind you that you have choice, that you can be at a choice point and you don't have to follow the path of least resistance or be led by your fears, then it's a great tool. But to the degree to which, you can just sort of discard your past and not plan for the future because you're going to meditate in a cave for 10 years at the extreme end of things. It's kind of like, all very well, but as you look back in your life, don't you want more than that? Like, don't you want to plan for projects and to pursue stuff and to like chant in a football stadium sometimes,
Is in, touching on that choice, he's saying like who we are and who we become is shaped by our choices, and that's how we get like experiential insight into who we are, what our preferences are, what a life well lived is by making choices. And he says, I choose, therefore I am, which is a kind of a version of an older saying, which I think therefore I am, isn't it? But he's saying like the simple act of making a choice, not being passive, not falling into indecision, and also the ability to know that in a way there's no wrong choice. It's like, I think that's something we've kind of discussed that we like to live by, is sort of trusting the fact that by making a choice, you'll discover who you are, discover what's important to you. And like meaning is to be found in that. And like personal growth is to be found in that too, because you know what you do and don't like, what's important to you, what isn't. I think, that's a really nice standout in this book for me. I think he ties it up really nicely at the end, talking about that.
Yeah, autonomy and choice, it is what underpins all of this. And that, as you said at the start of the podcast, that not choosing is a choice, just following social convention or procrastinating, putting it off. Those are still choices. We are inescapably burdened with choice in an existential way. And yeah, what was he talked about? I really like this. He had this image of, imagine you were making a sculpture of you, and it was like each choice you make is another sort of, I don't know how you sculpt at all, but another brush or another bit of clay on that sculpture. And it's like each time you lean towards, social convention, your sculpture of you is just going to be what other people want or expect of you, right? But each time you make a choice out of your own autonomy, you're truly making a creative and authentic sense of self. And
I've got the quote here. I'd love to read it out. Because it's I think it's worth hearing the whole way through. We build ourselves bit by bit through our choices. It gives us shape. We can refashion ourselves. We may change. We may become more or less unique. Stand back and look at it. Can we see meaning in its features? Before we die, we possess the creative power to give it vitality and energy that might almost make it come alive and start moving of its own accord. I really, really like it. It's kind of a nice way of viewing it, isn't it? That like each of these choices just kind of shapes us and tests ourselves against reality, and we can kind of challenge our previous assumptions, and we can change in meaningful ways, and also treating it in a sense of like life as a sense of play and experimentation, that we can try new things. We can throw caution to the wind and do something totally different, whether that's, taking an opportunity that presents itself to us that we never thought we'd normally take, but just kind of going with it and seeing how we go. Like, do we float? Do we sink? Or, also like seeing how we go when we do kind of like give in slightly to some like hedonistic pleasures, or allowing ourselves to do things that we wouldn't normally do, giving ourselves like permission to kind of reshape ourselves and view ourselves in a new way.
He summed up the kind of philosophy by saying, act first, think later, kind of as a counter to the idea of, think before you act. And he was saying, no, the time for thinking is after your action experience, then you can reflect on it. But like he's like in a typical career seeking scenario, you'll be asked to fill out all these forms of like your aptitudes and things like that, doing aptitude tests and like trying to think your way into your perfect job, whatever that might be. But he was like, that's backwards. You want to act first, like take a load of jobs, get the experience, really see what it's like, shadow people, volunteer, and then think about your experience. And he said we've been too easily led into trying to plan and think our way into our actions, and that kind of corrupts or hijacks the Carpe Diem mentality of, well, try something first and then reflect on it afterwards.
I was thinking just kind of there's one more thing I was hoping to touch on before we wrap up, and I think it was one of the aspects of 5 ways to seize the day around spontaneity. So there's the chapter on recovering our spontaneous selves. And I thought that one was interesting in the sense that he advocates for us developing the habit of like improvised, unplanned living. So kind of saying that like the plan is that there is no plan. And I think it touched on a little bit what we said before around kind of giving yourself space to do things that are unplanned. And one of the things he suggests is in your diary each week, like giving yourself, say, like an afternoon where you've got like no plans, and you just kind of like walk out the front door and just kind of see what happens. Like, just kind of like
it's funny, isn't it?
Going with the flow. And and sorry, just to kind of before you jump in, he's talking about with spontaneity, it's around kind of accepting the offer that life gives you. Like, yes, when you say yes, you're open to adventure. When you say no, you're choosing safety, and keeping that in mind. Like everything that comes to you is an offer. So with that in mind, you can let go of assumptions, you can let go of your fears and judgments. And then he says, like, use everything as like a spark and kind of go with that. And I think that's a really nice way of conceptualizing spontaneity, that it's an offer for you you to take, not kind of as opposed to what I would view as like impulsive, which is maybe what I would consider like a bit more thoughtless. Whereas this is kind of things present itself to you and you can use your mind and be like, yes, I'm going to say yes to adventure. And that's a choice I'm going to make.
Yeah. And run with your like desires and excitement and ideas in the moment rather than having them pre-planned. And it was sort of a counterintuitive piece of advice he gave, which I thought was quite funny, but I can see what would work is to actually plan in times to be spontaneous. So like in our culture where everything is so planned, well, it's almost use that strength to your advantage and say, you know, from 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock on Sunday, I'm just going to block out that time, keep it free, and when 3 o'clock comes, I'm just going to see what I feel like and say yes to what life has to offer in that moment, and just run with any random ideas and actually use that. So I was given a paddleboard as a gift on my birthday, and I know there's a river nearby, and I didn't really know how you could access it and stuff like that. But after reading some of this book, I was like, right, I'm just going to chuck this paddleboard on my back and like find the river, and I'll find a way to get on it through a hedge or whatever. And I did it, and I had a great day out. And it's like, I probably wouldn't have done that. I probably would have stuck to my normal routine of whatever that was. But yeah, so I ran with that for a few days. It's quite funny. I jumped back on my skateboard as well, fell off and scratched my knee.
I like kind of how it's almost like acknowledging, like, yes, the culture we live in, like, you might be very busy and there's not a lot of time and we have a lot of responsibilities. And I think that's kind of like a separate challenge in itself, even in regards to, like, think about like lifestyle design. Like if your life's ended up that way that you have no time to do any of the things you enjoy or even any room for spontaneity, like maybe that's a more wide level existential question you need to start asking yourself. But he's saying, like, kind of for now, on a daily basis or a weekly basis, like you can find some time to just kind of like let go a little bit and just remove those assumptions, step out, like going back to another chapter, like step out of those roles you've already got, like as you know, as like a friend or a partner or like the worker, like, and if scheduling's the way you've got to do it, then that's the way it is. But I like that idea. That's something I practice.
Yeah. Well, you touched on it earlier when we did that Tony Robbins program and getting things done, building a second brain. It's so much like, well, especially that Tony Robbins one, it was like blocking and planning every half an hour of your day was basically recommended. It was so you could pursue your goals, and it was very future focused and stuff. But there are times where like you just get a desire and it's only there in that moment. Like, I don't know. So we do this podcast, right? So we plan the books in advance, and I know in a given week, I like quote should be reading a particular book. And sometimes like I might hear of another book and like, I'm like, oh, I really like my passion for that is right now. It might not be in 3 months time, you know? And so, but if you're constantly living with the plan you have at hand, you're constantly having to say no to things that are coming your way. And sometimes it is nice just to grab your passion and like keep that fire alive while it's there and just run with how you feel in the moment.
Well, he says, you know, kind of in the end chapter as well, like choices, when we actively make choices, we know that we're rejecting certain things and accepting other things too. I think kind of with being spontaneous, you're kind of you're rejecting the plan slightly. You're rejecting like sticking to schedule and worrying about tomorrow necessarily. You're just kind of going with what feels good, and like a healthy balance of that is really good. But then you can go too far the other way where, like, you know, if you're constantly being spontaneous at 11 o'clock at night and you've got work at 7 in the morning and you've got that kind of that's going just your routine and order. Maybe you're best off saving your spontaneity for the weekend. I don't know. The risk of sounding
it's funny, but it's there's no clear-cut answer, but it's a serious question you ask yourself, right? You can obviously, there's in not planning anything, there's a risk of regretting not pursuing things you wanted to, and some things take discipline, don't they, and practice, and lots of meaning we find in our lives comes from projects that we have to, you know, really find willpower to pursue. But I guess he's saying the opposite end of that is, well, what if you do all of that at the expense of ever being spontaneous, and that's obviously too far. And so, remember that part of living is running with the moment and carving out a bit of time in your life to make sure that can happen sometimes.
He talks a bit about maybe this is something for next week's podcast, but he talks a bit about how like technology has kind of interrupted our ability to be spontaneous, and how we kind of, it's very rare now you could just like call someone up and be like, hey, what are you doing? Do you want to do something? And it's kind of like people tend to be busy, or people tend to have stuff planned out. And I think he says we mistake being spontaneous for like not exactly what it is. Like he thinks that being spontaneous is kind of going along to like last minute choosing that we haven't committed to.
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah.
Someone was saying, I can't remember. It was like his housekeeper or something. He asked about, he was telling them about his book and about technology, and they were like, well, I use technology to be spontaneous. I don't know where I will be tonight. Someone will ask me to do this and someone else will ask me to do that, and I might choose last minute. And he's saying that can just turn into flakiness where you don't commit to anything. And it's like, you're always looking over your shoulder for the FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. Am I at the best thing I could be at, or is there another party down the street that's better than this? And
it's really like
not committing to any plans. Yeah.
And he's saying like that's not being spontaneous, just kind of reducing it down to kind of last minute decisions.
Yeah, never committing and just bailing on people all the time, or not, is not the same as spontaneity. Yeah. There's one part of this book I don't want to end this podcast without covering, and that was some of the psychological blocks to
awesome
to Carpe Diem, and there were 4 that he covered. So there was risk, overload, apathy, and procrastination. And this really started to kind of hit home, because in reality, what actually stops you doing these things, and it's our psychology, right? So if we, ran with risk, he talked about in Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's studies on that were covered in the book Thinking Fast and Slow, that if you ask people to flip a coin, and if they lose 100, let's say pounds for sake of argument, £100, how much would they have to win to be willing to take the bet? And so most people won't take a 50-50. Most people won't take, well, if you win, you get 100, and if you lose 100. And he said most people wouldn't even take if you win 150 and lose 100. But the majority of people would take, well, if you win, you get £200, and if you lose £100. So he's basically saying that we tend to we tend to dislike the loss about twice as much as we enjoy the payoff.
So we exaggerate the losses.
So we're more likely to play it safe, right? We're evolutionarily programmed to not take the risk unless the potential for reward is like double the potential of what the risk is. And he's saying that's a psychological block sometimes to seizing the day, especially in a world where there probably aren't lions running out to get us in the way that our psychology evolved in. And so it I guess just being aware that we're all different, obviously, but as humans, we tend to be risk averse, and actually to seize the day and to live acknowledging that I'm going to die someday, whatever I do, and that I don't want to have these kind of regrets, that you will have to go beyond your comfort zone and take risks that don't feel good in the moment, but which you will thank yourself later for having taken.
I think also ties into that, as kind of in terms of psychology, like the risks we don't take because of fear of failure, embarrassment, loss of social status, loss of approval, how we're going to appear to other people. I think there's a lot that plays into that as well.
That's a great point.
Do we not take short-term risks because we're worried about our long-term appearance to other people or reputation, that sort of thing? I think that's
right.
Something
Yeah. So risk isn't just falling off the Twin Towers, isn't it? And physically hurting yourself. Most of our sense of risk is, as you just say, it's social risk. It's risk of judgment, risk of like other people looking at us funnily because we're breaking the mold in some way or not following social convention. And we can get trapped in thinking that really matters. Like it reminds you of the chimp paradox, where he was like saying, just choose the people in your life who actually care to you and try to only allow their opinions to sink in, so you can sort of block out the opinions of the masses and of strangers. Because if you consider like the whole world your tribe, you'll never be able to do anything, because someone's always going to judge you for something.
Interesting parallel there. I hadn't thought of that one. Awesome. Nice. What were the other the barriers that kind of stood out to you? I know there's four. Procrastination, apathy, and overload.
I think probably procrastination is the one that stands out for me.
Yeah. I think I sent you a quote on that and you thought I was having a subtle dig at you.
Well, you probably were. Probably rightly so. But no, again, I guess it ties into risk anyway, doesn't it? But this idea that it's so easy to put off things that you're passionate about or that are risk taking in some way.
I think the bit I liked about this one was
failure
Yeah. Sorry. I think the bit that stood out different in this one is that, that sometimes the payoff is too far away for us.
Oh yeah.
I know we've spoken about that in other podcasts as well. If the reward for what you're doing is too far away, you're less likely to kind of act on it now. But I guess it's there's some lessons to be learned in kind of either like delayed gratification here as well, knowing like the work you do now, like in for example, like if you read like those 3 chapters of the next book we're going to do tonight, it means that you're not going to have to do it on the night of the next podcast ahead of time
right,
or whatever. Like that sort of stuff. And I think, kind of like that whole I'll do it later attitude is obviously like a barrier to us doing meaningful things. But I guess sometimes that there could be a balance between kind of putting off something for the long term, for short term enjoyment from other areas we talk about in terms of like spontaneity and seizing opportunities, but kind of going too far one way, like not considering any of your future goals, you're going to kind of set yourself up for some shortcomings in the future.
Yeah. What I liked about this part is he threw in a personal anecdote. So he said that he was in this job that he initially enjoyed, but had started to become routine and mundane. And he'd had this idea for a while. He wanted to run workshops on living the good life, practical philosophy, that sort of thing. And after kind of complaining about this for a while, his wife said, well, like, you don't have to leave your job to do that. Just run it in the kitchen on the weekend, invite some people over and just give it a crack. And he was like, now I've heard that I could do that. So he did. He invited some people over and he sort of ran a workshop in his kitchen. And that ended up turning into what is now the School of Life. And
being willing to do things kind of maybe in an unfinished way, get the ball rolling without things needing to be perfect.
Don't let
like perfect. I think this is probably the bit that maybe stood out, was like not letting the need for perfection get in the way of kind of any sort of progress. Or taking the first step, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And what underpins perfectionism, right, is this idea, well, if I put something out imperfectly, it's going to get mocked, it's going to get judged, I'm going to like be seen as incompetent, and that's going to hurt and feel shameful and stuff like that. But he's in terms of sort of courage and what you're going to look back on life having regretted or not, it's like you just need to put yourself in the arena and give things a crack. And it's okay to fail. It's to be expected. It's like making mistakes and falling and is part of the learning process.
Mm-hmm. The other one was overload, which I imagine won't go too much into. That's kind of around like, the paradox of choice. We've got too much choice, so we don't end up making a decision. So he's suggesting like limit your choices. And he says being satisfied with the minimum acceptable outcome. So the concepts of like doing something like good enough, which is a bit of what we're talking about there with procrastination. Certainly like in our current culture, there's so much choice of things we could do or we could be. But actually, realistically, our choices are probably a bit narrower than we think. So we might as well kind of, we could like narrow them ourselves and kind of take a step and like pursue one single thing and see how that goes, as opposed to trying to overload yourself, as he's saying.
That's one of Jordan Peterson's rules, wasn't it? About just choose one thing and just go for it and see how good you can kind of get at that. And it's kind of like, well, when you do that, a barrier to choosing to do that is you're going to cut off loads of infinite array of other options. If you choose something that's a high-end career, like clinical psychologist, doctor, whatever. That's going to take years of study, and you only have so many years on the planet. So by definition, you're cutting off so many other options. And when you haven't made that choice yet, you have just a plethora of choices. And to some degree, that clinging to that is like ignoring the fact you're going to die, right? And actually you just have to slice some of those choices away by committing to something. Otherwise you just risk drifting and never following
stalling.
any path. Yeah,
just stalling. I'd be interested just to look at the last one, apathy. He says it's like lack of interest, lack of concern, lack of enthusiasm. Talks about like the sin of sloth. I think the word laziness could get thrown into here. It's I guess there can sometimes be some like psychological barriers in terms of like just generally being like stressed, depressed, lack of meaning, having a lack of agency, sense of powerlessness, depending on your maybe domestic relationships and circumstances. I think it's I guess it's a barrier worth acknowledging, that sometimes people don't have the energy to seize the day. Like they simply don't have it in them to kind of make the most of opportunities, or they don't feel like they can make choice or be spontaneous.
So there's there's sort of a spectrum of what we might call depression, right? And we all fall on it at some point in time. But like I guess what underpins depression fundamentally, if it's psychologically caused, is powerlessness, helplessness. Is that, well, whatever I do, it doesn't matter. So what's the point? And and obviously this isn't going to be a catch-all cure for depression, but like wherever we find ourselves on that spectrum, his advice was kind of like, find something you can just use your agency with and just choose to do. So however small it is, just like breaking the mold and just experiencing yourself as having choice is so important to feeling like you have any sort of power. And if you don't feel like that, it's right. If you seriously don't have power and choice, then what is the point? There's no point in choosing if you can't choose. That's tautological. And he takes it all the way to like Viktor Frankl talking about life in the concentration camps and people who manage to find some like when all their like physical freedom and physiological freedom in terms of food, and when all that stripped back, can you find anything in your life that you still have choice over? He's saying like, a lot of the times the people who could find that seem to be able to keep going. He also gave the example of like when an elderly spouse died, very often the partner will die quite soon after. It's something like once that essence of meaning is dropped from our life, it's just hard to carry on. So it comes back to that sense of freedom and agency and knowing that you have choice somewhere.
I think we've discussed some really interesting points today. I've really enjoyed that. It was I didn't know how much we'd be able to cover, but I feel like we've really given it a good crack here. I think that was great. Thank you. Yeah. Any I guess any final reflections at all, or you reckon you've given them a good crack? I'd hazard to say you have.
One last point is on morality, I think. So it's worth just noting that this, although to some degree this has a moral framework, he's saying that recognizing your own choice is sort of an ethic you can choose to follow in your life. However, this doesn't cover this isn't a fully encompassing philosophy. It's one essence to your value system, and so it doesn't. Obviously, he talked about you can be spontaneous by like punching people, and you can be mindful whilst being a sniper. Yeah. This doesn't cover morality. And he points that out and points out that, if we truly want a Carpe Diem value, then to some degree, we should want to value other people's capacity to have a Carpe Diem value. And therefore, we don't use our Carpe Diem to steal other kids' lunch money or attack people. So just pointing out that in being spontaneous and hedonistic, we essentially, this doesn't cover morality, but his advice would be don't do it at the expense of other people's freedom.
Yeah, if you believe in like the Carpe Diem ideal, you shouldn't act in a way that deprives people of their ability to seize the day. And he's on top of that, you know, kind of saying like, to take it a level further, like act in ways that enhance other people's ability to seize the day. Whether that's like providing them with opportunities, encouragement to overcome apathy or procrastination. Like there's, it's not just about you. It's about, you know, kind of helping other people to achieve their free lives, and in turn creates a better community, a better place to live for everybody.
Yeah. Nice. Any final takeaways from you, Will?
Look, I reckon I've covered everything.
Fair play.
Fair play. So next week we'll be covering Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. So this is all about how the impact of technology, social media, just the constant buzzing and pop-ups on our phones and emails has kind of interrupted our ability to live meaningful and quality lives. I think it's a nice follow-on from this in terms of some of the things that Roman brought up about you know, how technology interrupts and disrupts our lives. Particularly interesting because Luke's probably a little less distracted by technology than I am. So there'll be some areas we'll be able to learn off each other, and some maybe some blind spots we can fill in for each other. But been reading this so far, great book. Be really interested to look into it because we haven't done a whole lot on technology, and I guess it's a very prevalent thing that affects a lot of people. So
we've covered a bit of physical minimalism, haven't we, in terms of our actual stuff? But I'm excited to cover some stuff about digital minimalism, and like you say, it ties in really nicely to these cultural hijacks of like how technology can sort of overtake our essence to see the day by just buying it and being immersed in our phones and whatnot. So excited to cover that.
Great. Me too. All right, mate. Well, thanks again, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Yeah. Seize the day, mate.
Seize the day, innit? Bye.
Take care.